Hello and welcome. This is Malachi Bishop, and this is week 2 of RC-750 Rehabilitation Counseling Research and Program Evaluation. This week we will be talking about ethical issues in rehabilitation counseling research. You will be completing and turning in the completion of the city training. I hope you found that. I'm sure you did find it interesting and useful. Very important to have a good understanding, obviously, of the laws and guidelines in ethical counseling, rehabilitation counseling research, and ethical research. I think the city training is an excellent, very informative, and very interesting way to go about developing that understanding. We will not be talking further about the content of the city training, but you should understand that the content of the training will be material that you may be tested on. So the key ideas and the main points in the city training, as well as some of the research that you read about that famously or importantly led to some of the current research laws and guidelines. That information, you may see questions about that on one of the tests for this course. So do be aware of that. But we will be talking in this section about the CRCC Professional Code of Ethics for Rehabilitation Counselors. You should be aware, if you're not already, please be aware that the Code of Ethics for Rehabilitation Counselors is available at this website, crccertification.com, and that's the Commission, the CRCC's website, and you can find and download from that site a free copy of the professional code. You should be aware that there are a lot of other very helpful resources available at the CRC website in the ethics section. A lot of information there that's interesting and useful on ethics. So I encourage you to take a look at that site. But this section today, what we will be talking about is a particular section of the Code of Ethics, and that is the section on research, obviously. You should be aware, as with the city training, that the research section of the Code of Ethics, I want you to read that section and be familiar with what the Code of Ethics has to say about ethical rehabilitation counseling research. And be aware that you may also see test questions, exam questions, from the Code of Ethics, the section on research. So hopefully you have read, certainly hope you will read the entire Code of Ethics, but for the purpose of this course and the exams in this course, you will need to review the Code on Research, and what I'm planning on talking about in this section is both some of the ethical principles that the code is based on, and how those principles relate to rehabilitation counseling research. And then I'm going to highlight a few of the sections in the code that I wanted to particularly draw your attention to. So first, let's look at some of the ethical principles, and then we will look at some specific sections of the code concerning research. But you will be responsible for the entire, though it's quite a brief section on research in the code for this course. So the first ethical principle I want to identify and talk about is non-maleficence, or to do no harm. Beyond not doing intentional harm, non-maleficence means that researchers will minimize the risk of harm for research participants to the extent possible. and make sure that participants are aware and informed beforehand about any risks. And the question is, are there risks involved in participating in rehabilitation counseling research, and what are those risks? Where's the harm? I believe there's potential for significant harm in research, obviously. There's potential for direct and secondary effects of participating in rehabilitation counseling research. Some of these potential risks include invasion of privacy, loss of benefits or employment, civil or criminal liability, embarrassment, stress, family and interpersonal discord. How would these things come about? A variety of ways that we're going to talk about. Things like people accessing the data that we collect, that information becoming available to people that it's not supposed to be available to. So not protecting the information that we collect, not keeping it confidential. Being observed participating in research. There are all sorts of ways that people who agree to participate in our research could be placed at harm if we're not careful. I was thinking about an example of I've frequently conducted focus groups as a part of my own research, and the idea of, for example, holding focus groups for highly stigmatized conditions like HIV or epilepsy in public places was something we had to consider very carefully, and actually avoided doing in our research, because the idea of putting up a sign that says this way to the focus group for people with epilepsy, and essentially asking then your participants to self-identify in public settings as having these highly stigmatized disabilities. So we have to be careful at every stage of our research. And if you have not fully considered the research, its design, its purpose, whether you have to do the research, and all of the potential risks and benefits of participating in your research, I would say at best you are probably wasting people's time and indirectly creating an impression that participating in research is a waste of time, making it less likely that people will participate in research in the future, because researchers are casually willing to submit you to inconvenience without respecting your time. So in a sense, as a researcher, you represent researchers. Worst case, you are engaging in activities that can create significant harm to the individuals involved, the participants. And more broadly, bad research can threaten, more broadly, persons with disabilities generally. We can lead to bad research, can lead to faulty conclusions that lead to bad practice that can be harmful to people with disabilities that we serve. So bad research is unethical research, is the point I want to make. And from the beginning, we have to think it through. We have to consider all the potential risks and make sure that we are avoiding the risks that we can avoid and informing participants about the risks that exist. The second ethical principle, is beneficence, which means to do good, to promote through your actions the well-being of others. And the idea here is that implicit in the potential for your research to do good is the idea of competence. In order for your research to be of value, in other words, you have to first, as a researcher, have reviewed and understand the literature. Make sure that there is a need for the research that you're doing, that it hasn't already been done by other researchers, that your research will actually contribute to our understanding. In other words, avoid wasting people's time. Conducting a study involving people as participants in a study that adds nothing of significance to our knowledge because the researcher didn't do his or her homework. Conduct research within your skill level, competence, your capacity for designing, conducting, and analyzing the results. So it is an important ethical consideration. Do I have the capacity, the resources I need to do this research well and effectively, and as a result, to do good, to promote the knowledge of the field, to improve the profession. The third ethical principle is autonomy, respecting the right of others to freely make informed decisions and to take actions according to their will. And the research relationship in autonomy is the critical idea of informed consent. And you learned about the Nuremberg trials and the Tuskegee study of untreated syphilis, examples of research that was done, if you could even call some of the research that was considered in the Nuremberg trials research, but things that were done to people without their consent, without their knowledge. And you learned about the events that led to the current laws and guidelines concerning informed consent. And so you know, as a result of your city training, that there are several elements of informed consent that need to be included when we are recruiting participants, when we're asking people to participate in our research. The things that need to be included generally include a description of the research that you'll be doing. You need to answer questions like, what will I be asked to do as a participant? How long will it take? What are the risks and benefits? Do I have the right to withdraw without penalty, loss of care, loss of treatment? We provide contact information so that people can follow up with questions, concerns, or complaints. And are there any alternatives to participating in this research? The next two principles, justice and fidelity. Justice is the principle that we will be fair and equitable in the treatment of all research participants or potential participants, meaning people who are considering participating in our research, and we will promote equal opportunities. This also addresses fair and equitable treatment of our research partners, people who are working with us, and research assistants, making sure that people receive proper credit for the work that they did, for example. We will be fair in the treatment of funders, agencies that we are working with or that we are doing research with, and so on. And then fidelity is the idea of being honest, being loyal, keeping faith, and keeping agreements. And the research relationship here is that in research, this fidelity addresses such issues as the informed consent process, being honest and explaining to people forthrightly the risks that they are may be facing if they participate, all the information that they need to know, debriefing and explanations after the data is collected, as well as honesty in the analysis of the data and honesty in the presenting of the results. So those are the ethical principles and how they relate to rehabilitation counseling research. You learned about institutional review boards in the city training, and I just wanted to quickly highlight, because a lot of you may be working in agencies now or in the future that are not associated with a institutional review board. As you know, the 1974 National Research Act directed that all institutions receiving federal support for research and evaluation studies, universities, public schools, hospitals, and nonprofits establish IRBs, institutional review boards. If you are working at an agency that does not have an IRB, you should be aware that you can access local existing IRBs, so you can work with a local university that has an IRB board. You can work with them to conduct your research, and then there are also for-profit IRB centers where a researcher can have a board review their research before the research is conducted to make sure that it is approved and goes through the review process. So keep that in mind if you're in an agency that doesn't have an IRB but you want to conduct some research. There are options for ensuring that your research is conducted ethically and legally. Okay, now I want to spend a few minutes, and I said, remember, we're not going to go through the whole section. I just wanted to highlight what I think are a few key ideas in the section of the Code for Professional Ethics for Rehabilitation Counselors, 2010, Section I on Research and Publication. It's a relatively brief section, and it includes a section on research responsibilities, informed consent and disclosure, reporting results, publications and presentations, and confidentiality. So let's look at some of the key ideas here. The first idea I want to emphasize is from section I1, research responsibilities, and the idea that the ultimate responsibility for ethical research practice lies with the principal or primary researcher. All others involved in the research activities share ethical obligations and responsibilities for their own actions. The person doing the research, the person with the primary responsibility for the research, is the person responsible ultimately for seeing that the research is conducted ethically. Second point, section I2 under informed consent and disclosure. The code talks about the importance that individuals have the right to consent to become research participants, that they are provided with a specific sort of information that we talked about earlier, and it's also talked about in the code. I want to highlight a section or statement from a different section of the code that I think has relevance here in terms of thinking about providing information to people with disabilities about participating in research and some of the issues that might come up there. So as you know, earlier in the code, it talks about the professional disclosure statement and the idea that rehabilitation counselors have an obligation to review with clients orally, in writing, and in a manner that best accommodates any of their limitations, the rights and responsibilities of both the rehabilitation counselor and the client. And it further says that for individuals not capable of giving informed consent, when individuals are not capable of giving informed consent, rehabilitation counselors provide an appropriate explanation to and obtain agreement for participation and appropriate consent from a legally authorized person. So if the individual is not capable of giving informed consent, there are avenues, and it is important to get the appropriate consent from a legally authorized person. The reason I bring up the professional disclosure statement here and with respect to informed consent in research is the idea if we are doing research with people with disabilities who may have limitations of various sorts in communication, we need to think about providing the informed consent information in a way that is appropriate to the individual that we are giving the information to, a manner that best accommodates any of their limitations. All right, the next section I wanted to talk about briefly, deception. We don't use a lot of deception research in rehabilitation counseling. but sometimes it is very effective. Sometimes it is the only way to do research. Deception is used a lot in social psychology research, and it can be a very effective and, as I said, sometimes the only way to answer a research question. Just be aware that the code says that if such deception has the potential to cause physical or emotional harm to research participants, the research will not be conducted, regardless of the prospective value. And when the methodological requirements of a study do necessitate concealment or deception, the investigator will explain the reasons for this action as soon as possible during the debriefing, so as soon as the research experiment has concluded. All right, I want to talk about confidentiality of information under the research section of the code. It says information obtained about participants during the course of research is confidential. When the possibility exists that others may obtain access to such information, ethical research practice requires that the possibility, together with the plans for protecting confidentiality, be explained to participants as part of the procedures for obtaining informed consent. So we have to identify the risks, and we need to let people know in the informed consent process that these exist. So this addresses a number of issues. This addresses the obtaining of information during the research process, the storage of information once we have obtained it, and these days also the transfer of information. For example, if we are collecting information electronically. I have in the past collected research information from participants through emails, for example. When the possibility exists that others may obtain access to such information, research information, you need to think about that. You need to make sure your participants are thinking about that. There are a number of ways that email information, for example, could be accessed by people who are not part of the research study. So these sorts of things that are part of the design and the methodology, we need to consider those, and we need to make sure that people are aware of the risks, and people are aware of how they can minimize the risks of their confidential information being seen by others. All right, the code talks about reporting results and the importance of reporting accurate results. It says that rehabilitation counselors will plan, conduct, and report research accurately, provide thorough discussions of the limitations of their data and alternate hypotheses. So that's an ethical requirement, that we talk about limitations and we talk about other possibilities. Rehabilitation counselors do not engage in misleading or fraudulent research, distort data, misrepresent data, or deliberately bias their results. Is this an issue? We'll look at that in a second. They explicitly mention all variables and conditions known to the investigator that may have affected the outcome of the studies or interpretations of data. And they describe the extent to which results are applicable for diverse populations. So there's a few things there to pay attention to. I want to go back to this idea of ethical analysis of the data and ethical and accurate presenting of the data. And this is a meta-analysis, so it's a collection of studies. It's a review of a number of studies looking at the question of basically honesty and accuracy in data analysis. And this 2009 meta-analysis by Finelli identified that on average about 2% of scientists admitted to having fabricated, falsified, or modified data or results at least once. Up to a third admitted a variety of other questionable research practices, including dropping data points based on a gut feeling, changing the design, methodology, or results of a study in response to pressures from a funding source. And in surveys asking about the behavior of colleagues, fabrication, falsification, and modification had been observed on average by over 14% of respondents. Other questionable practices, up to 72%. Over the years, the rate of admissions has declined significantly, but in terms of non-self-reports, so in terms of reporting about other people, there hasn't been a decline. So when you talking about what you've seen other people do, basically these sorts of practices are still occurring. So rehabilitation counselors involved in research, certainly scientists, certainly there is the potential for a lot of questionable practices. And clearly the code is saying we need to be accurate, we need to be honest in the presenting of our results. Reporting errors in the same section. If rehabilitation counselors discover that we have made errors in our published research, so let's say we do a research study, we send the manuscript in to a professional journal, and they publish the journal, we will take reasonable steps to correct such errors, and this will be done either through an erratum or through other appropriate publication means, and that means that the publisher of the journal will publish a correction, and that's usually the way that will happen in a later issue of the journal. You can publish a correction if you made a mistake. It's ethical to report that. And then replication studies are also addressed. Rehabilitation counselors are obligated to make available sufficient original research data to qualified professionals who want to replicate the study. So you collect data, you conduct a study, you publish the results. This one says that if another researcher who wants to replicate your study wants to use your data, then you are ethically obligated to make the sufficient original research data available to another researcher. So keep that in mind. That has implications for storing of data, which is also addressed in the code. All right, I wanted to talk about this idea briefly in terms of publications and presentations. The idea that when conducting or reporting research, rehab counselors are familiar with and give recognition to previous work on the topic, observe copyright laws, and give full credit to those to whom credit is due. And this is true in research publications and presentations, as it is true in your class papers, all course papers for this program. You're reading the research, you are developing your own ideas, but when you are presenting your ideas, your papers, your research, it's critical that you give fair credit to the people who informed your ideas. So that's a summary of some of the key points I wanted to highlight in the research section of the code. And just final reminder, I'm asking you to review the research section of the code and be prepared to answer questions about that in your exam. And that will conclude our discussion of rehab counseling research ethics.